Please take your seats. It is a great honor to open this session, and our first speaker will be Dr. George Savran. Dr. George Savran received his PhD from Brandeis University in 1982. He is presently Director of Biblical Studies at the Schechter Institute for Jewish Studies in Jerusalem. His books include Telling and Retelling, Quotation in Biblical Narrative. I remember that it helped me when I worked on my thesis, and Encountering the Divine, Theophany in Biblical Narrative. The title of his lecture is On the Structure of Abraham Narratives. George, please.
Thank you, Yael, and thank you, the organizers of the conference, for putting together such a wonderful collection of people to talk about Genesis. What is the central point of the Abraham narratives as a whole? Should we read the entire narrative as a life story, showing the growth and development of Abraham's character from youth to old age? Or is it perhaps a continuous story about his quest for an heir, a theme which continues throughout Genesis as a whole? Or perhaps we should follow the Midrashic tradition about the spiritual growth of Abraham as he endures 10 trials which test his faith. The stylistic similarity of the outer ends of the Abraham narrative can be seen in the well-known gradation of language at the beginning of the cycle in Genesis 12, 1 through 3, go forth from your land, from your birthplace, from your father's house, and the introduction to the story of the binding of Isaac in chapter 22, take your son, your only one whom you love. When we read through the Abraham narratives from beginning to end, we can easily discern the overall pattern of a life story. There is no birth story for Abraham, nor are there any tales of a heroic childhood. The narrative begins with his migration from Haran, concludes with his death in Canaan in Genesis 25. But when we look more closely, the order of the stories does not follow a clear progression, especially when compared to the more conventional chain of events in the Jacob cycle. Along the way, we encounter a number of important events in Abraham's life: foreign adventure, warfare, parenthood, but the order of these events and their correlation with the normal progression of life stages is less than clear. Abraham's descent to Egypt with Sarai and the ensuing intrigue follows strangely upon the divine promise which precedes it. The subsequent separation from Lot is no less surprising, since we expect Lot to play some role in inheriting Abraham. This mention of Lot's departure is tied loosely to the military engagement with the coalition of kings in Genesis 14. But Abraham the soldier is an odd fit with the larger context of Abraham the keeper of flocks. The covenant of the pieces which follows in Genesis 15 bears no relation to the plot line thus far. Abraham has been promised land and offspring twice before, and the forecast of Egyptian slavery and subsequent redemption is at best loosely related to the present context. Sarah's subsequent initiative to secure an heir for Abraham in Genesis 16 is surprising in light of the divine promise of offspring in Genesis 15. And the long-awaited promise of offspring through Sarah finally appears in Genesis 17 and 18. But why is the narrative fulfillment of this promise delayed until Genesis 21, by the lengthy episode of the destruction of Sodom? The Avimelech episodes in Genesis 20 and 21 come out of the blue, and the demand to sacrifice Isaac upon the altar is most surprising of all. From all these examples, it should be clear that the continuity of plot is not the central principle of organization of these stories. In addition to the difficulties in finding a clear linear progression, there are a number of doublets in the narrative whose placement is confusing. The wife-sister story occurs near the beginning of the cycle in chapter 12 and once again close to the end in chapter 20, and raises questions as to how these stories balance off one another. Likewise, the fact that the two stories involving Hagar in Genesis 16 and Genesis 21 share many common features, such as theophany to Hagar in a desert location, a divine promise about Ishmael, and this raises questions about their interrelationship. And why should the promise of Isaac's birth appear twice in chapters 17 and 18, with different divine reactions to Abraham and Sarah, respectively? Some see these doublets as indications of a chiastic arrangement of the narratives, but these arguments are not totally convincing. Like many suggested chiasms, they work well only some of the time, and many of the ostensible parables between narratives don't quite match up. Others have suggested that the second doublet reflects a reworking of the first. So the behavior of Abraham with Avimelech is an improvement upon, or a tikkun, of the story of Abraham and Sarai in Egypt. But here too, the solution is partial at best. Another proposed organizational principle focuses on parallel behaviors or actions. Abraham the host in Genesis 18, 1 through 15, and Lot the host in Genesis 19. The birth of Isaac and the birth of Ishmael. The covenant of the pieces in Genesis 15, and the covenant of circumcision in Genesis 17. These are certainly suggestive of a larger unity, but once again the overall structure doesn't quite hold, for there are episodes with no parallel at all, such as the battle of Abraham with the kings in Genesis 14. Somewhat more promising is the oft-stated idea that the stories coalesce around a central motif. Thus, Abraham's childlessness, mentioned initially in Genesis 11, finds expression in Abraham's complaint in Genesis 15, in the attempt to produce offspring through Hagar, and in all that follows with Ishmael and Isaac. Martin Buber has argued that the motif of seeing unifies the stories in an organic way. To the land which I will show you in chapter 12, the vision of the covenant of the pieces in chapter 15, theophany in chapter 18, and finally to the Akedah, where on the mountain of the Lord there is vision. And while all these ideas give a certain shape to the larger narrative, they too are appropriate only for certain chapters in the cycle. I would like to suggest a different model, one which focuses on pairs of adjacent stories which are set off one another. In each case, the initial story is characterized by some initiative of Abraham, taken without prior consultation with God, which leads to a certain degree of success. The second story, nearly always in the subsequent chapter, serves as a corrective to the first, demonstrating to Abraham that his initial choice was partially effective at best, and that divine guidance is essential to realize the larger aims of God. The pattern lays bare the didactic emphasis of the larger narrative. Abraham is the recipient of ongoing instruction, continuous correction of his attempts to assert his authority and control, in order to ensure that he will walk with God in a more consistent manner. And here, if you consult the handout, you will see that I have divided the stories into A stories and B stories. In each case, the A story details independent actions of Abraham, or of Sarah with Abraham's active participation in Genesis 16, and the B story describes a divine reaction to the previous. Let us start with the example of Genesis 16 and 17, first with attention to their dissimilarity. Despite the fact that both chapters deal with the larger theme of seeking an heir, they differ both in form and in content. Whereas 16 recounts the attempt to produce an heir with the aid of Hagar as a concubine, chapter 17 is focused around the long speech of God, who declares that the desired heir will come through Sarah and not through a surrogate. The idea of the covenant of circumcision is unique to this chapter. No similar ritual element occurs in chapter 16. Regarding form, Genesis 16 is a straightforward narrative with dramatic elements which give the chapter a clear structure. Chapter 17, on the other hand, consists primarily of direct speech and has very few narrative moments, such as Abraham's reaction in verses 17 and 18 and the narrated account of Abraham's compliance at the end of the chapter. Whereas Sarah is central to the first half of chapter 16, in 17, verses 15 and 16, she's mentioned, but she is absent as a character. And while Hagar is central to all of chapter 16, she remains unmentioned in 17. But when we examine the stories as contrasting narratives, a different picture emerges. Seen in this light, the basic difference between the stories is one of initiative and control, between Abraham's personal destiny and his role as a founder of the people. While the actual initiative lies with Sarah in chapter 16, Abraham is by no means a passive partner in this enterprise. He accedes time and again to Sarah's wishes, first with the plan to get a son by means of a concubine, and again in verse 6 with his decision to reinstate Hagar's status as Sarah's slave. It's likely that Sarah's accusation, Chamasi alecha, the wrong done to me is your fault, indicates that Abraham had granted Hagar status as a wife and not simply as a concubine. Throughout the chapter, all choices are made by humans. First Sarah, then Abraham, then Hagar herself. Her free will is reflected not simply in her decision to flee, but also in the dynamic of her interaction with the angel of the Lord at the well. 3 times the angel speaks with no intermediate response by Hagar, as she pointedly withholds her agreement to the angel's request. Only after the angel's third speech promising Ishmael's independence does she consent to return and submit to Sarah's and Abraham's control. A son for Abraham has been gotten by human initiative, and it would seem that the problem of an heir has been solved. Chapter 17 tells a different story. Abraham's heir will be produced not by human initiative, but by obedience to divine dictate. The growth of a people will be the result of a divinely initiated covenant, and Abraham's obedience to that covenant will be the determining factor. The only action which Abraham is instructed to perform, circumcision, is of a purely ritual nature, and its purpose is to signal his acceptance of the covenantal promise. The ritual of circumcision is to be an ongoing practice. It indicates human imitation and obedience to the divine, and is to be contrasted with the one-time human initiative of using a surrogate. Ishmael appears in both texts, in 16 as the apparent solution to Abraham's problems, but in 17 only as a runner-up to Isaac. In both texts, naming has a special role, but in very different ways. In 16, Abraham names his child, as in most birth narratives, as the culmination of the drama of his conception and birth. In 17, it is God who assigns names and new identities, first to Abraham and Sarah, and then to Isaac. In 16, Ishmael will be set apart from others, characterized by his opposition to all those around him. By contrast, in 17, he is to be the head of a line, from whom 12 Nesi'im will come forth. If the focus in 16 is upon the immediate future, in 17 it is upon a more distant future. Abraham is the father of nations, and Isaac is the forebear of kings. The experience of the divine is both visual and verbal in both texts. But in 17, God's speech is longer, more authoritative than the angels addressed to Hagar. In 16, Hagar declares that this is the God of her seeing, whether being seen or seeing herself. And this is tied simply to place etiology, be'er l'chai ho'i. But in 17, God appears to Abraham at the very beginning of the encounter and identifies himself by name. Abraham's falling on his face indicates complete and immediate obedience, in contrast to Hagar's more skeptical reaction to the angel of the Lord. While 16 describes an imperfect attempt to solve an immediate problem, 17 focuses on the nature of a future covenant community. The birth of Ishmael in 16 is an isolated act with limited promise. This is contrasted with the circumcision of Ishmael in 17 and its long-term promise, and even more strikingly, with the annunciation of the birth of Isaac. In all these ways, the contrastive relationship between the chapters is clear. Chapter 17 is placed after 16 not only to refute Abraham's choice of Ishmael, but also as a reproof of his use of a surrogate to gain an heir. As a second example, let us examine Genesis 14 and 15. Here the difference between the two chapters is even greater, for there is no narrative connection between Abraham's victory over the coalition of kings and the covenant of the pieces in 15. The texts are very different in style and content. The first is a continuous narrative which describes a local conflict with a coalition of kings, during which Abraham succeeds in rescuing his nephew Lot from captivity. Abraham plays the part of a noble warrior, displaying military prowess and disdaining any personal reward for his actions. Chapter 15 consists of two parts. Abraham's plea for an heir and God's promise in 1 through 6, followed by the description of the covenant of the pieces and the prediction of Egyptian slavery in the rest of the chapter. Abraham voices questions about his future in both parts, but is otherwise completely passive, following God's dictates throughout and preparing the animals for a covenant ceremony. Among the few points of connection between the chapters is the root Mem Gimel Nun, first in 14:20, where the Canaanite god El Elyon is described by Melchizedek as the one who delivered over the enemy, Migain, into Abraham's hand, and then again in 15:1, when God describes himself as a shield, Magain, to Abraham. The connection may seem slight, but it captures the essence of the contrast between the two stories. In Genesis 14, El Elyon is seen as the delivering God, a point which Abraham may well accept, for he raises no objection to this. But God's claim in Genesis 15 is that he is the protector. The point can be taken further. If in Genesis 14, Abraham proves himself to be a deliverer, one who rescues captured people, in Genesis 15, God tells Abraham of a more extensive bondage to come and an even greater deliverance, the exodus from Egypt. Abraham is told in so many words that his military successes do not hold the key to the future. This is tied exclusively to a divine plan in which there will be no military deliverance by heroic soldiery, but redemption only by a divine hand. Consider as well a few additional points of contrast between the two texts. In chapter 14, verses 11 and 12, 16 and 20, much is made of the term rechush, goods which were captured and which are now returned. In 14:22, Abraham swears an oath that he will accept no spoil as a reward for his actions. But in 15:14, Abraham is told that he will enjoy deliverance of another kind in the future, and it will include rechush gadol, great wealth. The second text comes to correct Abraham's perspective. The refusal of wealth is all well and good in chapter 14, but greater wealth will accrue to his descendants as a result of the Exodus, not to mention possession of the land of Canaan, which is granted to him in 15:18. Abraham's oath in 14:22 is thus contrasted with, indeed superseded by, God's covenantal promise to Abraham. Lot is captured along with other people, and Abraham's military actions deliver them from captivity. This deliverance is followed by a double mention of the root yatzah. The king of Sodom comes out, by Yitzeh, to meet Abraham in 14:17, and Melchizedek takes out, otzi, bread and wine in 14:18. Both of these actions celebrate the victory that has been won. By contrast, Genesis 15 foretells a longer period of captivity followed by an exodus from that enslavement. The language of 15:7 clearly parallels the life of Abraham with the future exodus. I am the Lord your God who took you out, otzetika, of Ur of the Chaldees. And this is an obvious allusion to the beginning of the Decalogue, I am the Lord your God who took you out, otzetika, of the land of Egypt. According to 14:15, the Israelites will go out from there, Yetzu, with great wealth. The emphasis is again placed on God being the liberator, not Abraham nor any other human king. Melchizedek is described in 14:18 as bringing a ritual offering of bread and wine to El Elyon. The ritual can be contrasted with the covenant of the pieces in chapter 15. Where the priest performs the ritual in 14, Abraham, following God's instructions, performs the ritual in Genesis 15. While the ritual of 14 is one of giving thanks for a deliverance which has already taken place, the ritual of 15 is oriented toward the future. It represents God's promise of the future deliverance of Israel from Egypt, for the torch passing between the pieces prefigures the Exodus itself. It passes between the gzarim, the pieces, precisely the term for the parted waters of the Reed Sea in the Exodus in Psalm 136:13, La gozer yamsuf legzarim. The overall point here is that Abraham the warrior is to be replaced by Abraham the obedient servant. The emphasis on his personal heroism in 14 is overshadowed by the promise of divine liberation, a far more important matter than the local rescue which is accomplished by Abraham. The relationship between Genesis 18 and 19 is more complex than the previous examples, in part because the chapters display a greater degree of narrative and thematic continuity. Genesis 18 consists of two parts, the Annunciation of Isaac in 1 through 15, and Abraham's dialogue with God about the fate of stone in 16 through 33. Each section is independent of the other, but they are joined by the active presence of God in both segments. For this reason, I've listed them on the handout as two A units. Genesis 19 is a continuous narrative about Lot and the fate of stone, concluding with the birth of two sons from incestuous relations with his daughters. In one sense, the two chapters present an unbroken narrative regarding the fate of stone, which is enhanced by the sharp contrast between Abraham and Lot. Abraham is portrayed as the consummate host, while Lot is a much inferior version who is unable to provide for the safety of his guests. In a reversal of roles, Lot ends up being protected by his visitors. They repel the hostile crowd and spirit him and his family away from the destroyed city. Abraham successfully enlists his servant and his wife to prepare a meal for his guests, while Lot is unable to persuade his sons-in-law to flee the city with him in 1816. In 1916 and following. Abraham argues with God about the possibility of sparing Sodom, whereas Lot negotiates with the divine messengers about where to flee to. Abraham's contentions are concerned with matters of justice and righteousness, while Lot's reflect only his anxiety about his own personal safety. Abraham is promised a son by miraculous means, while Lot gets his offspring by incestuous union with his daughters. All this comes to strengthen the image of Abraham at the expense of Lot. But in keeping with the theme I have been developing, chapter 19 can also be seen as a significant response by God to Abraham. In 1823 and following, Abraham is committed to the idea that there are righteous people in Sodom, and attempts to convince God to spare the city. But in 1927 and 28, he comes to see that God made his own assessment of the nature of the city.
The text is silent on Abraham's thoughts as he observes the smoking flame. But the repetition of the phrase in verse 27, Asher amad sham et pnei Adonai, the place where he had stood before God, deliberately recalls 18:22. Va'avraham odenu omed lifnei Adonai, and Abraham remains standing before God, suggesting that Abraham is now reflecting on his earlier conversation with God. While that conversation is often described as a negotiation between God and Abraham, Nathan MacDonald has correctly pointed out that there's no negotiation here, because God readily agrees to every demand that Abraham makes. 50 people, 40 people, 30, 20, 10. God says yes each time. Abraham places himself in the classic role of prophetic intercessor, but in contrast to Exodus 32 or to Amos chapter 7, we do not hear God's response immediately, nor is God's response verbal, as in the previous cases. It is revealed in the narrative of chapter 19 through the demonstration of the character of Sodom and the destruction of the cities of the plain. Abraham, looking out on the remains of the cities, is compelled to acknowledge two things about God. First, that God means it when he makes a promise. This is a decisive moment for Abraham, for this is the first of God's promises to Abraham that has actually come to fruition. Second, the salvation of Lot, if Abraham knows about this, referred to in the following verse, had nothing to do with righteousness, but only with God's affection for Abraham. This continues the pattern of previous A and B sections, for here Abraham's perspective on divine justice has been corrected. His argument for saving the city has been rejected, whether because of the overwhelming guilt of the city's inhabitants or the absence of 10 righteous people. God may have given Abraham access to the divine plan in 18:17 and following, but Abraham is forced to accept the fact that God's decision alone has determined the fate of the cities of the plain. The final three pairs of texts can be dealt with only briefly. In the next set of texts, there are a few significant changes. First, the A and B stories are not contiguous, as the expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael in Genesis 21, 1 through 21, comes between them. Second, only here is God absent in the B story. Here I'm speaking about the two stories about Abimelech. God is absent in the B story, and only here, as Abraham acts as the reprover in his stead. It may be that Abraham has internalized this corrective aspect, as his actions in the second story serve to rectify the behavior of another. In the A story, in 21 through 18, Abraham tries to dupe Abimelech by passing Sarah off as his sister. He's upbraided for this in 20 verses 9 through 10, defends himself somewhat weakly, but is ultimately rewarded for his actions with gifts of sheep and oxen. In the B story, the roles are reversed. In 21, 22 through 34, the servants of Abimelech illegally seize one of Abraham's wells, and Abraham rebukes Abimelech for this in 21:25. Now Abimelech defends himself with arguments that are not much stronger than Abraham's excuses in the previous story. This time Abraham gives sheep and oxen to Abimelech, apparently in order to make a covenantal sacrifice. While the two stories have a sense of measure for measure about them, the B story concludes with the making of a covenant between the two sides, which is a better guarantor of both sides maintaining trust than the mechanism of reward and punishment at the end of the A story. If the A story reveals the danger of uncertain boundaries between wife and sister, between king and sojourner, between power and morality, the B story clarifies at least the geographical aspect of those boundaries with an oath. The border between the territories is clearly established, and the king and Abraham seem to agree as equals. Intertwined with these texts are the parallel stories of the near death of a son. In 21, 1 through 21, Ishmael nearly dies in the wilderness, but is ultimately rescued by divine revelation, an angel in heaven. His mother Hagar bears some responsibility for the situation, but neither is Abraham entirely innocent in casting out Hagar. Perhaps adequate provisions for the journey weren't provided, or he might have objected to Sarah's demand more strenuously. In the parallel story of the binding of Isaac in Genesis 22, Isaac is nearly killed by his father at a distant place in the desert, but a divine revelation, by an angel from heaven, saves his life. While proper treatment of the Akedah deserves a much fuller discussion than time allows here, I would argue that Genesis 22 comes to correct Genesis 21 in making clear to Abraham that the trial of the expulsion of Ishmael was but a prelude to the more serious test of the binding of Isaac. If Abraham thought that by expelling Ishmael he had successfully dealt with the threat to the unity of his family, Genesis 22 comes to show Abraham that God poses a far greater challenge to the life of his son. One can also see a similar corrective at work in Genesis 23 and 24, albeit in a much more indirect way. In Genesis 23, Abraham purchased a burial plot for Sarah. But the price he pays is outrageously high, and it's clear that he has been outmaneuvered in his negotiation with Ephron the Hittite. In the complementary story of Genesis 24, Abraham's servant acts in his stead, and through successful and clever bargaining, obtains a wife for Isaac, outsmarting Laban at every turn. Most noticeably, where Abraham acts on his own initiative in Genesis 23, his servant turns to God for assistance, and the miraculous coincidence of expectation and result clearly indicates that a divine hand is guiding this negotiation. In summation, the advantage of this model for understanding the Abraham narratives is that it brings out the dominant didactic framework of the stories. Abraham continually attempts things on his own initiative, and in each case achieves partial success. The limited nature of the accomplishment reflects Abraham's perception of the issue at hand as a domestic matter, with the possible exception of Genesis 18, which can be solved by his own reasoning and resourcefulness. The corrective provided by God in the B stories addresses a broader temporal and conceptual template. The issue at stake is understood to be part of a larger concern, the development of the people Israel, the matter of the Exodus, and so forth. Abraham's free will is highlighted in the A stories, just as the B stories emphasize God's decisive control of the situation. In contrast to the Jacob cycle of the Joseph story, where God remains largely behind the scenes, here God shares center stage with Abraham. As such, the narrative has a continuous back and forth movement focused on the improvement of Abraham's actions and understanding. The Abraham we encounter in this reading acts of his own accord, but is corrected by God at every stage along the way. In 13 verses 14 through 17, God's address makes it clear to Abraham that he will not attain his goals through deception, as in his descent to Egypt, nor by giving Lot his choice of where to settle. The well-being of Abraham's descendants will not be determined by Abraham's abilities as a warrior, but by divine redemption from Egypt. An heir will be given to Abraham not by means of a second wife, but by a divinely authored miracle of birth and old age. God's decision about the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah is not the result of Abraham's moral pleading, but ultimately of God's own assessment of their guilt. Blessing will come to Isaac and Abraham not as a result of the dispossession of Ishmael, but as a reward for Abraham's obedience at the Akedah. And success in negotiation will not be the result of human bargaining, as in chapter 23, but of understanding the divinely effected circumstances surrounding the choosing of Rebekah. What we take away from the Abraham narratives, then, is an extended portrait of Abraham as an initiate, in need of instruction, and God as mentor watching over his pupil, providing guidance and correction as needed. This relationship is certainly unique in the book of Genesis, and perhaps in the rest of the Bible as well.
Yeah?
The argument is the narratives set against each other. I like the argument, but it doesn't always apply. Like, for example, in 6a, Abraham doesn't expel Ishmael out of his own free will.
Right.
God says he has to. He doesn't want to, and God says you have to. And
Right.
God sends him away.
Right, so there, I think there's a very serious question there about Abraham, and one could argue perhaps that one sees a certain amount of growth in Abraham, not necessarily a moral growth that we might approve of in not objecting to the expulsion of Ishmael, but on the other hand, with regard to the dominant thrust of the story, a growth in Abraham in accepting God's control and order. So I'm not quite sure about that. I think that's a very good point. And it may well be that the story, as I've described it, is also capable of describing change in Abraham. And so that it's not that Abraham acts in this way only and God in that way only, but that perhaps at that point we begin to see a change. And perhaps we've seen it earlier as well. Yeah, please.
Thank you for your interesting lecture. I would like to ask, why Abraham? I mean, why don't we find such a structure in the other patriarchal narrative suggests?
Well, I think it has to do with the character of God in the book of Genesis. And we see a very dramatic change in the Abraham narratives, compared, let's say, with Genesis 1 through 11, where God is active and aggressive and destructive, and intervening in the life of human beings in very direct ways. In the Abraham story, we see a pulling back. God is not intervening so much in the life of Abraham as telling him what to do, or telling him what he ought to be doing.
And of course, this progresses further when we move to God, the image of God in the Jacob cycle, and then again in the Joseph stories, where God is much more behind the scenes. So I think it's really part of a process of how the book of Genesis wants to portray the character of God. Thank you.